So let me talk a little bit about the content of the book and about the idea behind it. And then feel free to raise your hand if you'd like to jump in and ask any questions. The book came about as mostly the all the leftover ideas from the Bitcoin Standard, the things that I couldn't fit into the Bitcoin Standard, the most common questions that I would get from people about the Bitcoin Standard after the Bitcoin Standard. So when I would be talking about the Bitcoin Standard, people would ask me, well, then how is it going to work out and what's going to happen? Is fiat going to just go away? Is it going to die? All of these questions, which are not easy to answer, and of course not easy to fit into the Bitcoin Standard, which already had a ton of ideas and already had many viewpoints and concepts, and the stock to flow and time preference and money for trade and Bitcoin's technical aspects. So all of these ideas about basically how does Bitcoin, in a sense, the Bitcoin Standard explains why Bitcoin is likely to continue to dominate and kick ass into the future, but it doesn't explain how. It just explains the properties that give it this ability to kick ass into the future. All right, so I was saying, so there are all these loose ends, or the next issues about the next questions about the natural evolution of how Bitcoin is going to evolve, given all the things that we know about Bitcoin and about Bitcoin's hardness. And I started writing about these for subscribers. I ran a Patreon for a while, and I wrote a bunch of essays about how Bitcoin is going to evolve over time. And these were, they were pretty popular. People liked them, and I presented them in a few talks and a few conferences here and there. And in those places, I thought people liked them, and they thought they were pretty good. But afterwards, I came across, it was really, I think, the talk of Giacomo Zucco in Baltic Honey Badger on steel manning altcoin apologia, where Giacomo tried to explain the best case for altcoins. What is the best case for being an altcoin apologist? And, obviously you hear a lot of things about how Bitcoiners are evil, close-minded people because they only like Bitcoin and they don't like all these other things. And Giacomo really illustrated that he could make a better case for altcoins than most altcoiners can on a technical and economic level. And that kind of gave me the idea of how to frame the next book, how to really frame the book that follows the Bitcoin Standard, which is, let's make the best case for fiat. And then if we make the best case for fiat, we can look at that and Bitcoin and try and see how we can answer the question of how Bitcoin and fiat will coexist or evolve over time. And so the first third of the book, this book is divided into 3 sections. The first section, which is the first 6 chapters, is similar to the last 3 chapters of the Bitcoin Standard, in that it's a technical discussion of how the fiat system works. It's similar to what I did with the Bitcoin Standard in the last 3 chapters. So if you remember the Bitcoin Standard, the first 7 chapters talk about the history of money. Well, the first 4 chapters talk about the history of money. And then the middle 3 chapters discuss the economics of money and the importance of money. The 5th chapter discusses time preference, money, and the relationship between money and time preference. The 6th one discusses capitalism as an information system and the ability to trade and the importance of money for coordinating economic activity. And then the 7th chapter discusses the implications on individual sovereignty and freedom from money. And so with that kind of background, you then move on to discuss Bitcoin. But if the Bitcoin Standard was written in, say, 2005, the first 7 chapters could well have been written in 2005 without Bitcoin being invented. And then I could have used that as a springboard for launching into explaining how fiat works. So you could potentially read the first 7 chapters from the Bitcoin Standard and then read the first 6 chapters of the Fiat Standard. I think that would be workable. In fact, not just the first 6, but the first 15 or so, the first part and the second part. You could, you could leave the last 3 chapters of Bitcoin to be read after all of the fiat stuff. I think there's a case to be made for maybe potentially reading the book that way. So you start with the first 7 chapters of the Bitcoin Standard, and then you read the first, what is it? One sec. The first 12 of the Fiat Standard, and then you read the last 3 of the Bitcoin Standard, and then the last 6 of the Fiat Standard. You could do it this way. It probably flows chronologically better in that sense. So the first 6 of the Fiat Standard, the first part of the Fiat Standard is just fiat from a technical perspective. And for that, I really thank Bitcoin and Satoshi Nakamoto in particular for giving me the mental framework with which to study fiat in a way that's very different from what you would get from usual treatments. And whether the treatment is favorable to fiat, like what fiat economists and Keynesians would write, or if the treatment was hostile to fiat from what a free market or Austrian economist would write. I think using the kind of language of computer science, the language of software engineering, trying to understand fiat as a form of software, which it is software. At the end of the day, the majority of fiat money is software. We think of fiat money as a dollar bill, and the cover of the Fiat Standard has the $100 bill on the cover. But the vast majority of fiat money is digital, just like the majority of Bitcoin is digital, although some Bitcoin is printed out into a QR code for a private key. Some of it is printed out as a QR code for a public key, for a public address. And some Bitcoin is made physical through OpenDime and other kind of hardware wallets. But really, the majority of Bitcoin is digital, and the choice of using the QR code on the Bitcoin Standard on the cover is similar to the choice of using the $100 bill on the cover of the Fiat Standard, in that this is just the physical manifestation of something that's actually inherently digital. So if fiat is digital and you start thinking about it digitally, you can really make much more sense of how it works. And so in the first part of the book, I dig into trying to understand how fiat works if it was an altcoin. Imagine fiat was an altcoin and somebody was trying to propose it today. Or imagine if you were born into a Bitcoin monetary system and you're trying to study all these altcoins that were around, and you start studying the history of fiat and how fiat works. And that's kind of the motivation of looking at how fiat works in the first part. So you look at it and you see, first of all, the majority of the fiat money is digital. And then how is it mined and how is it transferred? What are the nodes? By drawing an analogy to how Bitcoin works, you can get a lot of clarity on how fiat works. So in the case of fiat, what is the node? Who's able to validate a fiat transaction? Who's able to say that this transaction is valid? You can't. You cannot decide. You cannot make final settlement decisions with your fiat node, whatever it is that you use as fiat, whether it's, say, your bank account or your credit card or your PayPal or your Venmo. None of that stuff can make decisions on what is a valid transaction or not. And most importantly, of course, none of it can make decisions on the monetary policy of fiat and how it works. Nobody can decide. You can't decide how much fiat you want to have in your economy. So there really is something like a node, although not a full node, is the central banks. Most of them are like nodes in that they get to decide on their own side chains, which is their own local currency. They can decide what is a valid transaction and what is not. But there's only one full node. There's only one full node that is able to decide everything on the entire network. It can decide monetary policy for everybody on the entire network. And that's the US Federal Reserve. And you gain a lot of clarity into how fiat works if you just recognize that fiat has one full node, and it's the US Federal Reserve. And so all the other central banks are like SPV nodes, simple payment verification nodes, which is not a full node in Bitcoin, in that these nodes can just verify your own payments, but they can't verify everybody else's payments, and they can't decide on the consensus parameters that are valid in the network. So if you're part of the Bitcoin, if you're part of the fiat network, if your central bank is part of the fiat network, the central bank is basically under the control of the US central bank. You think you have a country and you're sovereign and you have a sovereign central bank, but if your central bank does something that the US Federal Reserve doesn't like, you're kicked off the network. And you can look at countries like Iran and North Korea who are banned from using the SWIFT network for payment. And that's, your node stops working because there's a centralized node, and you're kicked off the network. They decide who gets to be on the network and who isn't. And that helps us explain a lot about the politics of fiat. And so in the second part of the book, we discuss what fiat money leads to. If you think about what this software leads to, well, imagine if you had a monetary system with one full node that can decide what all the other nodes get to do and can't do. That full node is going to be extremely powerful. And that's exactly what we see here in the case of the United States government and its central bank. Then, what are the other important engineering issues? Well, there's the issue of mining. So in Bitcoin and with gold, we know how Bitcoin mining works. Well, if you read the Bitcoin Standard, you can see how Bitcoin mining works. There's a process where you have to spend a lot of energy in order to produce output, and then the output is in order to produce these mathematical solutions. And when you make these mathematical solutions, they go into you're able to add a new block of transactions into the blockchain, and everybody gets to verify it. And it's pretty straightforward the way that you do it. Well, no, it's not very straightforward, but it is straightforward when compared to fiat, because at least all the nodes on the network get to see all the mining processes happen, and they get to mine themselves if they want to, and nobody can stop you from mining in Bitcoin. Now let's compare to fiat. Mining fiat requires a license from your local node, which also requires a license from the main central node. So the global central bank of the Federal Reserve decides which banks get to issue fiat money and which don't. And issuing of fiat is not done through printing. I think this is a very important point. Most people don't. I'm sorry. This is a very important point that most people don't get, which is that fiat money isn't paper money. It's not money that's printed out. The majority of fiat money is digital, and only a small minority is printed out. So the way that the printing is just bringing into physical form fiat tokens that already exist. The fiat tokens come into existence through mining or through lending specifically. When a fiat bank issues a loan, they make new money. This is the key engineering insight about how fiat works. And it's one of these very simple facts with very, very profound implications. Anytime a new loan is made, anytime your bank issues a new loan, you want to go buy a house and you take out a loan for $1 million. You've just mined fiat. You and the bank have gotten together and solved the fiat proof of work problem and gotten the license from the Federal Reserve to mine a whole bunch of fiat. They're going to give you new money that did not exist there. The bank isn't taking existent money that they have in their treasury. They're not taking another client's money and giving it to you. They're not taking money from their own capital and from the bank owner's savings and giving them to you. They're making new money, and they're putting that money out. They're paying that money to the person who's selling you the house, and the money supply has increased. So all over the US economy and the world economy, at all times when banks are making new money, they're essentially mining new fiat. And that's I think, a mind-blowing realization when you think about it this way, because when you compare it to Bitcoin, where all the nodes can mine if they want to, and they all have the same difficulty of mining, and they all have to do the same thing, solve the same mathematical problems. With fiat, it's different. You have to have a banking license, which, is not something very easy. It's not something that anybody can get. Anyone, you have to be well connected. You have to be pretty rich to secure a banking license. And once you have it, you're able to make new money. And every time you make new money through more lending, you're effectively, of course, devaluing the existing money. You're devaluing the existing money supply in the hands of all the existing holders of the money supply. So that's what's really the process of mining in the case of Bitcoin. Now think about the in the case of fiat. Now think about the implications for that. And that's really the topic of part 2 of the book, Fiat Life, where we examine what are the implications of living in a world in which money is constantly mined every time somebody gets into debt. Now, the most obvious implication is with gold mining, everybody wants to become a gold miner. And oil, with any kind of money, when something is monetized, people are trying to make more of it. So if somebody were to declare copper as money tomorrow, a lot of people are going to have a big incentive to go and mine copper. A lot of people who don't know anything about the copper business are going to decide, you know what, I'm going to start digging holes and figuring out how to refine earth metals and make copper out of them. And that's going to increase the supply of copper. If you made gold into money, if you made silver into money, if you made oil into money, if you make anything into money, people will work hard to produce more of it. And it'll increase the supply of this thing. Well, what are the implications of making debt money? The implication is that people are going to work very hard to try and make more debt. And when you think about it this way, well, that makes a lot of sense, doesn't it? Everybody is in debt in the fiat system. In fact, everybody runs a negative balance. Everybody owes more fiat than they have fiat. Nobody, well, not nobody, nobody who has money, nobody who's rich owns more fiat than they owe. Nobody has more fiat in their checking and saving, or not nobody, but most rich people will owe more fiat than they have fiat in their saving account and their checking account. And if they don't, they're not going to be rich for long. If you're a rich person and you put your money in fiat and you have a positive value of fiat, it's going to lose value over time and you're not going to be very rich and you're going to keep getting poorer over time. The winning move under the fiat system is to get into as much debt as you can, because debt is mining fiat. Debt is making money. It's printing money. It's exactly like hitting gold as a gold prospector. It's like mining Bitcoin, but the difference is that it's not a fair mining process. It's a process where people who are able to borrow at favorable rates have a much easier difficulty algorithm, and so can solve the proof of work problems much easier than people who can't mine and who aren't able to borrow at low interest rates. So therefore, in the fiat system, it makes sense. If you can borrow, you should. And in fact, if you look at some of the most successful business people in fiat, or maybe all of the most successful business people, this is what they do. The biggest debtors, the people who borrow the most in the fiat system, are the richest people in the world. The largest corporations and the largest individuals, they're the ones who are able to secure the most loans, because it makes a lot of sense for them to do that. And if you read, for instance, Robert Kiyosaki's work, which is enormously popular, and it's built on this idea: accumulate hard assets and accumulate as much debt as you can. Borrow to buy a house, and then get a good credit rating, and then borrow to buy another house, and then rent out the house. And now you're gaining rent and you're paying off the debt. And Kiyosaki doesn't frame it in this sense, but really what's happening is Kiyosaki has figured out the way of mining fiat. That's what you do. You get into debt, and so you're able to mine more and more fiat. You accumulate hard assets that are scarce and hard to produce, and so your assets are hard things that gain in value over time, that appreciate in dollar terms, but your liabilities are in fiat, because fiat is declining in value over time because everybody's borrowing fiat all the time. And so everybody's mining more and more fiat. And so more and more fiat is always being mined. And so the fiat supply is always increasing and the price is always declining. So that's why everybody is in debt. And that's, it's not just individuals, it's also governments and corporations. If you're not in debt, you're in trouble. You're in massive trouble. You have to get into debt. So that's one implication. And then the other implication is that getting into debt becomes an even bigger, a more successful way of making wealth, of becoming wealthy than working productively. And so you see more and more of the world's financial system, more and more of the world's labor force, more and more of the world's smartest people. They don't do anything productive except mining fiat. They're in the fiat mining business. There's really not much of a difficulty adjustment in fiat. And so you look at the financial system, it's just all these companies that are constantly lending and borrowing from one another. And really, a lot of people who work in banking will get to this moment, which is, what exactly are we doing? Why are we moving all of this money? Why are all these companies investing in one another? And the answer is, every time you make a new company, every time you engage in the new financial transactions, you're able to borrow more, you're able to make more fiat, mine more fiat. And so more and more of the economy is based around mining fiat, and therefore less and less is based around productive activity. So that's one aspect of it. And of course, the other aspect is that, the ability to mine is determined by the central bank. And the central bank, of course, is captured by the central government. Or you could say that the central government is captured by the central bank. The book doesn't really get much into politics. It's more of an engineering book than a politics book. So it doesn't matter who you think is in charge in this relationship, whether it's the central banks or the government. What matters is that, they're, as I call it, the bastard child of this incestuous relationship between central banks and government is this monster called the Fiat Standard, this government central bank entity that is able to make more and more money. And that entity can create money out of thin air. And that entity effectively continues to have infinite power over society for as long as it continues to operate, until, of course, the currency collapses. But before the currency collapses, the system continues to just operate and work. So this is kind of the engineering perspective on fiat and how it works. Obviously, the book is much more in depth in this idea, gets into debt. And then the final chapter in the first part, chapter 6, talks about the benefits of fiat. What is fiat good for? And really, the one thing that it is good for is its ability to move value across space. So I begin the book with looking at the history of how fiat came about. And, the common propaganda you hear from fiat influencers and fiat shills is that, fiat is better than gold because it allows us to prevent deflationary economic contractions. And that's nonsense. The gold standard was working fine. There was never at any point somebody who came up with a serious proposal saying, hey, you know what's wrong with the world? What's wrong with the world is that we can't print more gold. And I figured out a way of making a money that's better than gold because we can print as much as we can, as much as we want from it. And then they proposed that. And then, there was a democratic referendum, and then people decided that, we want to choose this new money. That's nonsense. Gold was working fine. The gold standard didn't fail. It was deactivated by governments who were looking to finance their government spending, looking to finance their spending during World War I. And that's really the reason that they were able to get away with it is because gold is really extremely expensive and heavy to move around. That's the key operational feature that fiat has. The one thing that fiat has going for it is that moving obligations, moving debt, when money is debt, moving debt around is simply communicating information. So with fiat, you can send money with a telegram. With gold, you had to send money over ships and trains, and that was risky. And so I show the problems with sending fiat money across oceans. And, to give fiat its due, this is the problem that fiat solves. And this is why fiat succeeded in replacing gold, even though gold has much better salability across time, in that gold holds its value much better. But fiat is able to move value across space much better. That's the one thing that it has going for it. And that's really the framework that you need for analyzing Bitcoin and fiat. That's the focus of part 3 of the book. But I think I've gone on for too long, so I'm going to take a break now and see if anybody has any questions or anything they want to add while I catch my breath. Yeah, Suli, you want to speak?
Yes, sorry for the background noise under the car. First off, I pre-ordered the book and a couple of books for some CFOs that were resistant to the orange pill. Is Bitcoin, how Bitcoin is mentioned in the Fiat Standard?
Yeah, so we begin with this framework. The first 6 chapters are explaining fiat from an engineering perspective, and then in the second chapter we explain the consequences of fiat on society and how fiat has basically ruined everything. And then the last 6 chapters 13 to 18, are an explanation of, or basically why Bitcoin fixes this. Can Bitcoin fix this? How does Bitcoin fix this? So really, this is a book about Bitcoin, and it is the sequel to the Bitcoin Standard. I think, when you read it, you're going to see that it's a continuation of the Bitcoin Standard. And we do take a 12-chapter detour of discussing fiat. But, the Bitcoin Standard itself was 70% not about Bitcoin, or maybe 60% not about Bitcoin. So similarly, the Fiat Standard talks mostly about fiat, but it talks about fiat not for the sake of fiat. It talks about fiat for the sake of getting into Bitcoin. So in the middle 6 chapters, we go over the damage that fiat does. So the main one, my favorite hobby horse, is time preference. Fiat just raises everybody's time preference, because basically we went from a monetary system where the money supply under gold used to increase at around 1.5% to 2% per year every year. And then we moved to the Fiat Standard, and the money supply over the last 60 years has increased at around an average of 14% per year overall. So the global money supply increases by about 14% per year, which is enormous, which means that in 5 years, roughly, it loses half of its value. So what does that do? That just means that, look at any country where there's a hyperinflation, and then imagine that hyperinflation happening at a slower pace, and then tell me, does that offer you a good explanation of what the world looks like today? I would argue yes. I'd argue the entire 20th century was just slow motion hyperinflation. If you look at Lebanon or Venezuela today, or Zimbabwe, when the currency is collapsing, everybody's fixated on the present, and people don't think so much about the future. And they're unable to think a lot about the future, because the future is very hazy, very uncertain. You get your money at the beginning of the month, and you want to spend it as much as possible, and you can't think about the end of the month, and you can't think much about, saving for your life and what do you want to do 5 years from now. When your money can hold value, when you know that your salary today, 5 years from now, you can still hold, it'll still hold its value, so that if you saved your salary today, you'll still have significant amounts of economic value left after 5 years. Well, in that kind of case, you're more likely to think about the world in 5 years, and you're more likely to think about your life in 5 years. But when the money is losing its value, 5 years is just this extremely uncertain, extremely distant, extremely hazy thing that you can't afford to think about. You need to survive today first. If you don't make it through today, there is no you in 5 years' time. So it's pointless to plan about, your hopes and dreams for life in 5 years, because you need to make sure that you have food today. And providing for your life in 5 years is not possible when you need every single last cent of yours to provide for today. So you see this in hyperinflationary societies, and I get into this discussion on time preference in more depth in the Fiat Standard than I did perhaps in the Bitcoin Standard. And then we see the impact that it has had on food, on science, and on energy. And this might sound initially like, oh, it's weird Bitcoiners going on about weird Bitcoin things, and Saif and his stakes and his obsession with stakes. But I think there's more to it than just me wanting to tell the world how much I love stake. I really think this is an enormously important topic, and I think it's enormously important precisely in the context of Bitcoin and in the context of how the world is evolving now, and in the context of all of this insane totalitarian nonsense we hear about central bank digital currencies and the Great Reset. So anybody who's alive today knows that the majority of the world thinks that animal foods are bad for you, and they give you heart attacks, and they're bad for the environment because cow farts destroy the atmosphere and boil the oceans. And the same is true, obviously, for hydrocarbon energy, for fossil fuels. They're bad for us. Burning fossil fuels to stay warm is a very selfish thing. It allows you to survive the winter, but it's boiling the oceans because we're putting these tiny little particulates of carbon dioxide into the atmosphere, and it's causing an apocalypse, basically, where it's boiling the oceans. Most people take this bullshit seriously. And I've studied this stuff quite in depth over the years, and I basically collected all of the stuff that I've learned in these chapters. I usually didn't like to write about this much because I don't like to talk about religion publicly because it's not very productive, and this is a religion. But I think 2020 has really made it clear that we can't afford to just keep watching as these crazy religions continue to get more powerful, more unhinged, and their propaganda gets more and more ridiculous. And I think the key point on how it relates to fiat is that the same thing happened with food and with fuels in the 1970s after the US moved off the gold standard, which is the price of fiat started, the price of food went up and the price of fuel went up. And these are the two most important consumer goods out there. Nothing matters to people as much as their food and fuel almost, because every day you need food and fuel to survive. Everybody needs it every day to survive in the modern world. And so when there's inflation, when the money supply increases, that inflation is most severely and most acutely felt in food and fuel. And so governments are extremely careful and extremely, they really hate the idea of their food and their fuel failing. And so, they hate the idea of their people being unable to afford food and fuel. And so, this becomes a massive issue, a massive political issue. And in the 1970s, you had the gas shortages, and you had food problems where people couldn't afford food, and poverty increased. And how did governments react to that? Like every inflationary government in history, the one thing they don't do is stop the actual cause of this. And the actual cause of the rise in the foods and the price of the food and the rise in the price of fuel is the inflation. It's, food is more abundant today than it has ever been. Fuel is more abundant today than it has ever been. And in the 1970s, it was more abundant than it was in the 1960s. It did not suddenly become scarce. And all of these other stories that they made up about why these crises happen are just complete garbage. The real reason is the money supply went up and the prices went up. But of course, the reasons that the government produced are all kind of really ridiculous religious cultish ideas, which come from, I'm not very good at studying religious history, but I think it's it's got some kind of ancient pagan notions of, humans are evil and the earth is pristine and divine, and the humans are just a plague on the earth. And these ideas became extremely popular in the 1970s, not just because they could help people arrive at an explanation that helps them understand why is it that we can't have fuel and food anymore, but also because governments benefits from these kind of idiotic explanations. Yes, the earth is reaching its limits. Yes, the earth is at capacity. That's why you can't find oil, because the earth has already, we've tapped the earth dry. We finished all the oil, we finished all the food, and we're all going to die. Now, human population has maybe doubled or tripled from the 1970s until now. And so the notion that we ran out of, and of course, per capita fuel and food consumption has increased. So the notion that we're running out of anything is completely absurd. We're not running out of anything. But what we are actually, we're running out of sound money. That's what it is. We're running out of good money, and so the price of everything is rising. But the important aspect of it is, I think, with the move towards fiat and the constant inflation, I would argue we witnessed an enormous regression as a human species in our ability to feed ourselves and in our ability to utilize energy. And so if you look at our ability to utilize energy and the amount of energy that we utilize over time, it had been steadily going up at around 2% per year since the early 19th century. And there's a chart in the book that shows that. From the early 19th century, we're going up in energy utilization at 2% per year. And then that curve stops, energy utilization per capita of 2% increase per capita per year. And then that stops in the 1970s and it flattens. And since the 1970s, we're more or less been flat. We're consuming roughly constant energy per capita. Now, think about how transformative energy is. And I highly recommend looking into the book called The Moral Case for Fossil Fuels by Alex Epstein. And also, my last podcast was with him. It was just released today. And we discussed this. His work is incredibly important on explaining the essential role that fossil fuels have played for our modern civilization. And really, if you talk to anybody who says fossil fuels are bad, you're talking to a child. You're talking to a child who doesn't understand the world that is around them, because we would not have anything of the things that we have today. All of the nice things that you take for granted that you use every day, we would not have them without fossil fuels. I would only take somebody who says fossil fuels are bad seriously if they're actually living their life without fossil fuels. But I don't know anybody like that. And I promise you, you don't know anybody like that. Everybody you know lives, unless, they're out in the jungle, living out in the complete wild and probably, dying and not surviving. They're reliant on fossil fuels for their survival. Very, 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 very difficult to not use fossil fuels today. Everybody, even the poorest people in the world, they benefit from them, because the poorest people in the world, they'll still benefit from the very cheap products that are only possible because of fossil fuels. So we've had this incredible improvement in our living standards for the past 200 years, come to a screeching halt in the 1970s when our consumption of energy stopped. And it stopped because governments started promoting all these completely insane ideas that, we can run a modern world economy on the energies that our ancestors used to live primitive lives, wind and sun, which is great. Wind is great. We need the wind, we need the sun, and it's nice to have a little, maybe solar panel here and there, or a wind turbine. But it's a huge stretch to go from thinking that you could have anything close to modern civilization with these energy sources. But we've had governments very actively and strongly promoting this nonsense because these things are very cheap compared to fossil fuels. And they're cheap because, they're worth it. They're cheap because they don't work. They don't provide the energy that you need. You can't have, you can't survive the winter on this stuff. And so if we manage to reduce people's consumption of fossil fuels, because we convince them that fossil fuels are bad because, they're boiling oceans or whatever the latest buzzword is all about, then you can reduce people's consumption of real fuels, and then that will hide and understate the extent of inflation. And the same thing has happened with food. In the 1970s, as the price of food started rising, all these insane cults were being promoted heavily by government agencies, telling people that no. The meat that is the common food of all humans all over the earth, there isn't a single, there's never been a society that lives without animal products. It's impossible to find. There's never been a third generation vegan. There's never been a society that's vegan. All societies, all nutrition everywhere in the world. And in the book, I get into nutrition in quite some depth, and I get into the work of Weston Price, who's like the Mises of nutrition. This is a guy who traveled around the world and went looking for the ideal Garden of Eden diet, thinking that meat was bad, he did this in the early 20th century. So when many parts of the world were still isolated and they didn't have trade with the rest of the world. And he went and visited very isolated tribes all over the world, trying to find somebody who had managed to live on this perfect Garden of Eden green diet without meat. And he couldn't find anybody. And even when he did find vegetarians, their entire food revolved heavily around animal fats. And the healthier the people were, the more animal meat they ate. So meat is the cornerstone of the diet of the human species at all times and all places. But thanks to fiat and thanks to inflation, we had in the 1970s these insane movements to try and tell people that no, actually meat is bad for you and meat is bad for the planet. And instead you should be eating things that are very cheap to produce, grains, because these things can be produced with mass industrialization. They're basically industrial products. They're not natural food. They're not food for human beings. They're industrial products. And agriculture in the 1970s, and I get to this into detail, focused on moving people toward eating heavily all these industrial products like grains and industrial oils, which are not very price sensitive, because the main, the input into them is heavily industrialized. And so they're not as price sensitive as meat. And so this new massive industrial food push came about in the 1970s. You can't separate it from inflation. And I show a lot of evidence of how it was linked to inflation and how these crazy ideas were promoted because of the inflation. The importance of that, and then, of course, there's a chapter on fiat science and fiat academia and the university and how universities have been completely compromised, which, serves to further these propaganda, whether it's on meat or on carbon dioxide and fossil fuels being evil, and basically to promote all of these insane ideas. And that's, I think, a kind of summation of the economic damage that fiat money has done in food, in fuels, and in education. And then there's another chapter on fiat states, which starts from the initial point that I began with earlier, of the fact that there's one central node, the Federal Reserve, and then how that allows the US government and its bureaucratic arms to essentially rule and run the world via the fiat system, via the fiat nodes that they install in different countries, and then basically get to control the economic activity of different countries because they get to install the only node that is interoperable with the fiat system that allows you to trade with the rest of the world. And then chapter 12, if you'd read the earlier drafts, this was not a separate chapter, but then I split it into its own chapter. So we always hear fiat people talking about the cost of Bitcoin and how expensive Bitcoin is and how much it costs to run Bitcoin. And, Bitcoin's boiling the oceans and blah, blah, blah. Well, chapter 12 turns the tables around and looks at the cost of fiat. what are the costs of fiat? So I do a cost-benefit analysis of fiat. So what are the benefits of fiat? Well, the one benefit of fiat is that it allows us to save on the cost of shipping gold, which is not zero, but it's also effectively zero when it's compared to the costs of fiat. And the cost of fiat is primarily the inflation that is constantly destroying wealth all over the world. And so there's something like one half, I forget the exact numbers now, let me dig them up, but an enormous chunk of the world's wealth every year is being destroyed by fiat, by inflation. And the important point, of course, is that the majority of this wealth is held in the hands of the poorest people, because the poorest people of the world are the ones whose wealth is mostly in fiat. So when you see the value of money declining, here's the number. So in 2019, the global broad money supply stood around $100 trillion, while total global wealth was around $360 trillion. So fiat money was about a quarter of humanity's wealth. If that money is being devalued at 14% per year, then humanity is losing something like 3.6% of its wealth on average every year to fiat inflation. So fiat inflation is every year sucking up 4% of the global wealth. If this trend holds over the coming years, basically, fiat is destroying $15 trillion of wealth every year. That's just the cost of fiat. Really makes Bitcoin look like a bargain now, doesn't it? When you think about the cost of fiat, it is. It's massively, massively more expensive. $15 trillion a year or so is the cost of fiat. And of course, this is a cost paid primarily by the poorest, because if you remember the analysis chapter in the earlier chapters, the world's richest people, and not just the richest, but anybody who's rich is able to borrow. They're banked and they can get credit and they're able to borrow. And so they're able to, they're short the US dollar. So when the dollar devalues, their debt devalues and they are better off. But the world's poor people, they are long the US dollar and they're long their local government shitcoin. And so when their local government shitcoin devalues, they are hurt because they don't have credit. They don't have the ability to borrow. They don't have the ability to mine fiat. So when fiat is devalued, these $15 trillion are hurting the poor a lot more than the rich. Perhaps it's accurate that the majority of that money is held by poor people. Is held by rich people, but it is a very tiny fraction of rich people's wealth. It's a very high fraction of poor people's wealth. So this destruction of wealth that fiat causes all the time is constantly bleeding wealth away from the world's poorest. And it's very telling that, all of these academics that are constantly harping on about inequality and demanding higher taxes for inequality, notice they all come from fiat universities. They're all financed by government spending, and they never, ever discuss the impact of inflation and the money that pays their salary on inequality. They don't discuss that. So that's one cost of fiat. And then there's the cost of the economic distortions, all the financial crises that fiat causes. And then there's the cost of having all these insane governments all over the world able to spend and destroy things like our ability to produce food sanely and destroy the university system in order to turn it into stupid propaganda outlets. And then, of course, finally, the cost of conflict. Conflict is a massive, massive cost of the fiat system because conflict is constantly happening in the situation in the world of fiat, because in fiat world, fiat is a system that runs on might is right. Who determines the validity of the ledger is not determined by proof of work. It's determined by who wins the world war. And so everybody's fighting with everybody all the time over fiat. We had 2 world wars since fiat's inception. And arguably, those world wars have not ended. They're just continuing in different ways all over the world. Governments are constantly able to finance war because they have a lot of money. They have a lot of printers. And they're able to constantly keep fighting because the stakes for fighting war in a fiat system are very high. If you win the war, you get to decide, you get to allocate all the world's wealth. If you win the politics war domestically, you get to control your national central bank, and then you get to decide your local wealth. So there's a lot at stake when money is political, and when money is debt, then conflict becomes a much more successful avenue for becoming rich than production. And that's, I think, a massive cost of the fiat system. That's basically the summary of the second part of the book. Shane, you want to add something?
Yeah, I have a really quick question. I hope it's related. So I recently and you can text me somehow later with the answer or whatever, but I recently joined your membership program, and I know it says that you get an audio of the Fiat Standard and an electronic version. I just don't know what that really means, because I've not seen a PDF if that's the way it's available. But so I'm just curious.
All right, I'll email it to you. You should have gone. I guess we probably sent it before you became a member. Yeah, well, thanks for letting me know. I'll email it to everybody.
But other than that, since I'm on the stage, if you don't mind, real quick, I'll just say thank you for coming on today and sharing this with us. So it's good information. And by the way, I'm using your Bitcoin standard in a simplified way, to work with at-risk kids in a Bitcoin savings program. So we're excited about that.
Oh, nice. Glad to hear that. Thanks.
Thank you.
So then we come into the third part of the book, which is Bitcoin. And I think, this is a very long, this has been a very long 12 chapters that go into all kinds of issues. But I really think it's all leading up to the discussion of the last 3 chapters very, very significantly and very relevantly, because really Bitcoin does fix all of this. And it fixes it in not just in a, my money is better than your money, and so it's going to fix things. And I know, of course, a lot of people like to laugh at the idea that Bitcoiners think Bitcoin fixes everything, but it really does. And this book, I think, you could, if you wanted to mock this book, if you wanted to parody this book, you could make a very good case that this book is basically me saying everything I hate is fiat and fixed by Bitcoin and is fixed by Bitcoin. I think that would be an entirely accurate summary of the book. But that is in no way a criticism of the book. If you want to criticize it, you need to actually explain why these things are not bad and why Bitcoin does not fix them. Because I think I make a pretty compelling case for all of these things being terrible. And I think I make a compelling case for why these things are caused directly by the engineering structure of fiat, by the way that fiat works, by the fact that fiat mining is lending, by the fact that the centralized node of fiat, there's only one centralized node in fiat, and it is the central bank of the US, and by the fact that the inflation is constantly rising and it's constantly being covered up, and the central banks are always trying to cover it up. I think all of these are a pretty, I'd like to see a good attempt to try and explain these away. And, a little piece of advice, like a lot of idiots tried to write critiques of the Bitcoin standard, and generally it consisted of essentially screeching and saying, this is ridiculous and correlation is not causation, which I think is the theme song of all of the world's idiots. Saying correlation is not causation is not a counter argument, because correlation can be causation and it may not be. Maybe it may not be. The fact that you're saying that it isn't always causation doesn't tell us anything about one particular instance. So it could be that this is the case. It could be that it's not. So my book presents evidence for it. You'd need to present compelling counter evidence. Either present evidence that disproves my evidence for this connection existing, or present compelling evidence for something else being the cause. The majority of the idiots who tried to critique the Bitcoin standard were just basically, some of them are people who don't know how to do fractions. Some of them from Twitter. They don't understand the difference. They don't understand the meaning of fractions. And, it's attention whoring, and it's meaningless to kind of make this critique of, correlation is not causation. Well, so what? There are a lot of things that are causal in the world, and saying that correlation is not causation doesn't stop these things from causing. It's getting cloudy, it's likely to rain. Maybe it won't rain, but it's much more likely to rain than if it was sunny. So saying that correlation is not causation is not really a counter argument to the idea that clouds bring rain. I think this is and I think a lot of modern education is really the indoctrination of idiots into repeating these kind of things in order to avoid noticing these very, very inconvenient facts for governments, and the governments that, of course, finance the education system to produce these kinds of idiots. So anyways, that little diversion on this aside, the interesting part then of the third part, the third part of the book then discusses how this is all related to Bitcoin. And it begins with the idea that, Bitcoin fixes this because Bitcoin is the exact opposite engineering design of fiat. Bitcoin, the third part of the book is called the fiat liquidator. Bitcoin just liquidates fiat. First of all, Bitcoin is saleable across space. It's much more saleable across space than gold. So it's much cheaper to move Bitcoin across space than gold. And so therefore, it already just removes the one good thing that fiat had going for it. It's far cheaper to move Bitcoin around. And so therefore, that undermines the use case for fiat. But secondly, perhaps more significantly, in terms of its impact, is the fact that Bitcoin is debt-free. In order to have money that can move around quickly, we've ended up turning our money from money, which is gold, into government debt obligation, the government debt liabilities. And we've had massive number of idiotic schools of, I shouldn't say thought, schools of thoughtlessness that have sprung up in economics over the past century, who strongly insist on trying to convince the world that money is debt and debt is money. And a lot of these people are unfortunately quite popular. And that's basically a result of fiat. It's basically fiat central banking propaganda. And it's not coincidental that this stuff is taught at all universities that are financed by fiat central banks, to try and convince people that money is debt and debt is money, and there's no difference between the two, and that this is just how it has always been, and this is just natural. And of course, it isn't natural. This is an absolutely insane engineering flaw in the fiat system, that it treats debt like money, because debt is not money. Debt is a promise for future payment. Money is the present settlement of present payment. Money is money that is, money can settle debts now, and it's final settlement. You get payment in gold, that's it. You're done. You have the gold, and then you can go and you can spend it, or you can keep it, and you don't owe anything from somebody else, and you don't have to trust anybody else, and you don't have to worry about whether that person is going to deliver on their promises or not. Fiat and debt don't do that. They are not that. They are a promise of delivering that in the future. So there's a very distinct difference between the two. And most people don't understand. And a lot of the people will just tell you, no, you can't, Bitcoin can't be money because Bitcoin is debt. Bitcoin isn't debt, and money is debt, which is insane. But Bitcoin is real money. It's not debt. And it allows us to have a money that can move around without it having to be somebody's liability. This is the key thing. So we can move it around like we can move it around like we move gold. In other words, it's final settlement, but it can move around very quickly, and it doesn't have anybody's liability. It's nobody's liability, and so that just makes it a much better money, and that makes it effectively anti-fiat technology. It prevents governments from being able to pass off their debt as money, and therefore it returns economic sanity to the world, where now governments need to earn money before they spend it, just like everybody else. Bitcoin is a neutral global currency that is not controlled by any single country. There's no single full node in Bitcoin. There are tens of thousands of full nodes, and you don't need a license from the world's biggest army in order to be able to run a node. You can just run a full node by investing a few dozen dollars in hardware and downloading some software, and that's it. So this shapes the discussion of the last section of the book, the last 6 chapters of the book. When we talk about Bitcoin scaling, how Bitcoin can scale. So then there's an extensive discussion there of the Lightning Network and how Bitcoin can grow in this kind of fiat world and why it would be different, and the trade-offs and risks that are involved with the Lightning Network and so on. And then there's a discussion of Bitcoin banking, how financial system built around Bitcoin could work, and why it would be different, and how it would be different from the current financial system. And then there's the discussion of energy, of Bitcoin and energy. And that's where we go back to the second part of the book, and the part on fiat money and its effect on energy. If you remember, in the energy, because of fiat causing inflation, we've had governments try and get their people to stop using the fuels that are essential for civilization. And it's been massively destructive for the world over the past 40, 50, 60 years. Well, Bitcoin, it's poetic justice, really, in that it's demonetizing government money. It's taking wealth away from government money. It's taking seigniorage away from governments, and it's directing it toward energy producers. And not just energy producers, but the producers of cheap and reliable energy. Cheap and reliable energy is is what Bitcoin finances. And that's something that fiat has been punishing for the past 50 years. Bitcoin just fixes that, and not only does it subsidize that, it subsidizes that by taking seigniorage away from governments. The governments were robbing the world of money through inflation. Bitcoin robs them of that income and redirects that income to energy. So, and then here there's an extensive discussion of energy markets and how energy markets function in Bitcoin, and the effect that Bitcoin will have on energy market, and then a discussion of the difficulty adjustment and what it means. And basically, the argument is that it's going to lead to the development of a lot of cheap, reliable energy sources all over the world. And when I've done that, we go through Bitcoin cost-benefit analysis. So then we do a cost-benefit analysis of Bitcoin. And this can get a little bit technical, this part of the book, because it gets into the costs and the mining cost of Bitcoin, how much money has been paid on mining Bitcoin so far, and how much money has been gained by holding Bitcoin. And when you run the numbers, it becomes very clear. And this was heavily inspired by Michael Saylor's analysis. It becomes very clear that, this is an incredible bargain technologically. We've spent something like $30 billion on Bitcoin mining at the time of publications, probably more now, but there was definitely more now, but there was about $30 billion is the total value of all mining rewards that have been spent on Bitcoin from day one. And that's given us $1.2 trillion worth of Bitcoin in people's hands today. So that's an incredible bargain. And that's a bargain because we've built a better technology. It's adding value. It's added enormous value to the world. And so then the final chapter concludes with, well, can Bitcoin fix this or not? But you know what? I've already gone on for too long, and I'm not going to spoil the ending. And I do want you to buy the book after all, so I'm going to stop here.
Thanks. Just before bouncing out, how long did it take you to write the book compared to how long it took you to write the Bitcoin Standard?
The Bitcoin Standard, I honestly wrote in 2.5 months. Some of it, I mean, there were some parts of it that I had written as parts of other papers here and there over the previous years. Some of the Bitcoin parts, as well as some of the economics parts. So these are things that I had written, which I had no chance of ever publishing anywhere, because who would publish such insane ideas? So I put them together, and I made So I put them together, and I spent, once I decided I wanted to write this book, I spent about 2.5 months really working really hard on making the book happen. And I remember, I decided I was going to write 1,000 words a day, and then the book just came out. And then there was several months where I was waiting for my editor to get back to me, and I did a whole bunch of editing for it. So the Bitcoin Standard was much faster to write, but it took a lot of time for editing. The Fiat Standard, on the other hand, I've been writing it since, I would say, October 2018. So it's really been 3 years. It's been a 3-year process of, I finished writing it in June 2021. So it's been almost 3 years of writing, but then the editing was far quicker. Alex McShane, who's here in the listening, he helped me with the editing. Hi, Alex. Thank you so much for all your work. Feel free to jump in and chime in and add anything if you like. He did a terrific job. Him and a couple of other editors, Steve Robinson and Che Allen, are also on Twitter, but I can't see them here. If they're here, feel free to chime in, guys. They did a very, very good and very quick job. I basically just announced it on Bitcoin Twitter, and I got a bunch of people to apply, and I got them to do sample chapters. Then I picked 3 whose work I liked. And so we managed to get through the editing of the Fiat Standard much quicker than the Bitcoin Standard. But the writing took much longer.
Got a question real quick, if I could ask. Is the Principles of Economics book a third book that's forthcoming, I'm assuming?
Yes, that's going to be done in a few months as well.
Okay.
Yeah. All right. Well, somebody was requesting to speak, but they've disappeared now. Who is it? Anybody have any questions? Anything you want to add? Yeah, Matt?
I haven't seen it yet. Who wrote the foreword to this book?
Ross Stevens.
Okay.
Matt, did you want to ask a question or say something?
Hey, yeah, I have a question. Well, first of all, I love the book, and thank you for writing it. And my question is, how do you start to open the conversation with someone who is really especially triggered by the climate stuff that you write in the book? And I found that with my own family and friends, conservatives seem to be a little bit more open to the Bitcoin world, whereas it seems like people who are very liberal, it's really hard to get through to them. And so I'm just curious if you have any tips or how you would approach like opening the conversation around some of these topics.
I'm probably the worst person you could ask about this. I'm an extremely undiplomatic person, and I just I don't have the muscle for framing things in a way that is palatable to other people. When I'm writing, I cannot think at all about how do I say this in a way that is going to appeal to this readership or that readership. And I think the reason that I managed to get to write the Bitcoin Standard was because I just decided, you know what, I'm just going to write what I think. This is what I think, and I'm just going to sit down and I'm going to write it. Like, writing a book is not easy. I mean, I think a lot of people underestimate how difficult it is. And I think there's this, it's kind of like when I was growing up, I used to think that, professional football players are just people who are born to be professional football players. And I was not born to be a professional football player. And, when you grow up, because my dad used to always tell me, you're not going to be a football player, you need to study to be a doctor. And then you grow up and you realize actually it's not so much that you're born. I mean, obviously there's an aspect of talent and so on, but more important than the talent is turning up and doing the job. And so professional football players, it's not just the fact that they have the talent, it's the fact that since the age of 5, they've been going to training every day. And if you do that and you do a whole bunch of other things, then you become football. And I think writing a book is kind of like that. It's not easy to put your thoughts together, especially if you have a lot of ideas, especially, if you want to put ideas together for 300 that need 300 pages to lay out. It's difficult to have the focus and the discipline to turn up every morning and sit at the keyboard and type away. And up until I was in my late 30s, I'd never written a book because I didn't have that discipline. And I think one of the key reasons that I managed to develop that discipline was to just focus on writing, getting the idea across. One of the kind of really good advice that I heard is it's from a fiction writer. I think it's I may not even remember his name. I think his last name is Nyquil. I don't read him, but I've heard somebody quote him once and it stuck with me. And he said, the best writing is the simplest writing. It's just to find the simplest way of saying something and say it. And it sounds kind of one of these platitudes, but it's actually very profound because it's very, if you want to write a long piece, if you want to write a book, you need to have the stamina to keep going through all of these ideas. And to do that, you need to express them. You need to lay them out. And if you start off with trying to be sophisticated, trying to be clever, trying to be complicated, trying to use fancy language, if you start off by deviating from the focus of just getting the point across and focus on other things, you're not going to make it. You're not going to be able to finish it. There are millions of unfinished novels out there. And I think a lot of them are due to the fact, not just novels, but all kinds of books. A lot of them are unfinished precisely because of the fact that the author was not writing simply and they were preoccupied with things other than just getting the point across. So I've just embraced this, that it's, I don't want the entire planet to read my book. And I write what I think, and you're free to read it, you're free to not read it, you're free to write a better book if you want, you're free to write a criticism of it, you're free to critique it, you can call it stupid, you can call it whatever you want. But I'm just going to write what I think, and let the chips fall where they may. And I think it's this is obviously kind of Bitcoin inspired. The ability to just say, well, this is what I think, is a very Bitcoin thing. Satoshi Nakamoto said, if you don't believe me or don't get it, I don't have time to convince you. And Bitcoin's operation is just constantly showing this. There's a new block every 10 minutes, whether you get it or not, whether you like it or not, whether you appreciate it or not, whether you think it should happen or not. That's it. There's a new block, and just make sure you have your own private keys so that you have your own Satoshis on that new block. And that's it. That's all the opinion that there is to it. So to a very large extent, this was kind of the inspiration behind my writing, and behind developing the courage to just put my ideas out there as they are, and not keep beating around the bush and trying to think about how they're perceived. And Yeah, I know it's going to piss people off, and a lot of people are not going to like it. And a lot of people are going to say, "Oh my God, I can't believe you don't believe in science. The science says, are you really going to tell me that 97% of climate scientists are wrong and you're right?" And the answer to all of these people is cry harder. Go believe whatever you want, read whatever you want, and I don't particularly care.
Thank you.
You're welcome. Anybody else? All right, Mark, go ahead.
Hi, Saifedean. Mark Lally here. Can you go into your thoughts around with regards to the sovereign individual and how you think that's likely that the conclusions from that book and the chapter, especially the chapter obviously in cyber cash, how Bitcoin is going to affect the concept and the paradigm of what a nation state is over the next, to say, the remainder of my lifetime. I'm 40 years old, but probably it's going to take 50 years to 100 years to play out, and how Bitcoin and decentralized money is going to affect basically the concept of a nation state, which is basically a central bank and the club of politicians around nation states, central banks.
Yeah, that's a very good question. To be perfectly honest, I think looking back at the Bitcoin standard, recently I've been starting to get this idea. I've been meaning to go into chapter 7 on the individual sovereignty, individual freedom, and that discussion, and to reread it, and to reread the sovereign individual, because I think I maybe I'm being maybe I'm wrong, I don't know, but I'm beginning to get second thoughts about the thesis of the sovereign individual and the discussion that I put into it about it in the Bitcoin standard, which is I think the idea that as they put it, the microchip is going to obsolete the nation state. Coronavirus and all the insanity that has ensued after that has, I think, provided a very, very strong counter argument to that, because this new global surveillance system that is being implemented under the pretense of fighting a virus, the complete panopticon that is being implemented in order to save you from viruses, where all the world's governments suddenly care so much about your health. The same fucking people that tell you to eat garbage and promote garbage food and tell you about how much you benefit from eating garbage. These same people suddenly care so much about your health that they need to track your every movement, and they need to lock you at home in a way that is exactly identical to what the Chinese Communist Party is doing. I think it requires some level of revisiting. I don't know, to be honest. I think perhaps tech geeks had underestimated just how much these things can be used by the government. And the main thesis of the sovereign individual is the idea that new technology changes the balance of power. And so there's a very compelling case about how the rifle led to more freedom, because before the rifle, if you had a big army, you could subjugate everybody. But with a rifle, individual landowners could defend themselves pretty effectively. And so it became much more expensive to be a feudal lord, and that led to more and more freedom. I think that thesis probably still holds, but I think perhaps we need to accept that new technology doesn't quite change the balance of power as drastically as we'd like to believe, because it's a constant game of cat and mouse, and new technology means new tricks for the cat and new tricks for the mouse. And so the same song and dance is going to continue. but they're just going to have more toys to play it with. So maybe it's not going to be this much of a change in terms of the ability of individual freedom and the ability of technology to introduce to strengthen individual freedom, because it's going to really strengthen the ability of the state to control things. And I think the really, really scary part of this is just the extent of how easy it's been to mobilize government agencies and government surveillance over the past few years, over the past 18 months, really. That with a flick of the button, just put a bunch of stupid epidemiologists on TV to scare people, and a bunch of fake videos from China of people being hit by a virus and keeling over and falling like they were hit by a bullet. And then suddenly 80% of the world's population, maybe it was less, I think maybe it was overstated, but a very large percentage of the world's population just became completely docile cattle, willing to accept whatever they're told on their TV. And the government apparatus just seamlessly transitioned to being a complete authoritarian straitjacket. The police suddenly were out there, and you look at videos from Australia. I mean, Australia, you think of Australia, you think beaches and surfing and great weather and the outdoors and nature and happy-go-lucky people, and suddenly you have people inspecting people's coffee cups to make sure they're actually drinking coffee when taking their mask off, and then they're not just carrying their coffee around to not have to wear the mask. I mean, it's gotten so complete in terms of its totalitarianism. It's absolutely scary. The same police force that a few months earlier had been, a lot of people hated the police, but a lot of people didn't. A lot of people thought the police was normal. And now the police was out there to protect them, but now they don't anymore. So I don't know. It's I don't really know. I'm not as confident about the main aspects of the thesis as I was before. But I would say the part of the thesis that I think is still holds is Bitcoin's ability to, and that's really the most important thing. That's really the grand prize. Bitcoin's taking away the printing press from the governments. I think that really shifts things. Now, how it plays out is a really difficult question to answer, and I get into it in the last chapter of the book, and I'd urge you to, pick up the book because it's nuanced and it's complicated, and then I can't just answer it with one word. But ultimately, the one prize, and that's why I think, again, the focus and the ability to just stay on. To keep the eyes on the prize in the case of Bitcoin, and not to get distracted by all kinds of irrelevant bullshit that people keep bringing up around Bitcoin, is that it's really not about anything more. There's nothing more important than just taking away the printing press. If we take away the printing press, wherever the chips fall will be much better than where we are right now. So surveillance tech, all of that stuff, all of the public health authoritarians, all of the climate Nazis, all of that stuff is going to be massively defanged if we just take away the printing press. That's really the key prize.
Yeah, obviously I agree with most of what you said. What interests me as a bookmarker recently, and I need to get into the article, is if Bitcoin takes away the printing press, what do Bitcoin miners do? Do they become the new central banks in a new world? It's just fascinating to pursue those ideas. And that's my final question, Saif. I don't know what your thoughts are around that, where if Bitcoin miners and the control over electricity, does that model replace the printing press? Does that model replace central banks? Who knows? There's no right or wrong answer to this, just pursuing the idea.
I don't think it. I mean, they've obsolete the printing press, but they don't really replace it in the sense that Bitcoin miners become the new central bankers, because Bitcoin miners are just they're just providing a market service to the Bitcoin network. They look for blocks, and if they produce, if they solve the proof of work problem and attach problems and attach transactions that are ordered correctly and that are in consensus with the network's consensus parameters, then they get rewarded. So they have to invest a lot of money up front in order to be able to get the coin reward in return. And they're basically subject to the discipline of the market. They're subject to the business discipline, and they're not. They can't dictate terms to the network. They can't decide what the network is. So they are very far from being able to play the role of central bankers. They can't print money. They can basically mine the pre-existing Bitcoin. We know the Bitcoins, they're already there. There's only 21 million Bitcoins. They're all basically, think about them as being underground in the cloud to mix up two metaphors. They're there, and the miners are just taking them out. And the cost of taking them out is roughly equal to their market value. It might be a little bit more expensive, they might lose money, or it might be cheaper, so they might gain money. But that's the only thing they're doing. They can't decide consensus parameters. They can't dictate anything for the network. So Bitcoin really is not going to replace central banks with any new oligarchy. It's going to just remove this remove the ability of a certain subsection of society to print money. That's it.
Thanks, Saif. Great work. Thanks a lot.
Thank you. Cheers.
Hey, Saif.
I've been talking too much, guys. Yeah.
I just
Somebody
got
else say something.
Yeah, I just got a DM from me. Hi is his name. It's at EEMI666. That's the person who just raised his hand before, and he said he has a quick question.
Well, let him raise his hand again. I can't see him.
Okay.
Where is he?
I'm gonna DM him. But yeah, never mind then.
Anybody else want to say anything? Rodolfo, you can speak. You muted yourself.
Wait, hey. I was on a conference call through most of the talking, and it was nice to ignore the conference call and just listen to the talk. So I've been doing a lot of reflecting on the thesis of the sovereign individual, and I think a lot of stuff is really sort of it really doesn't fit. I think there was sort of like an idea, conceptually, kind of like, they got a few things right, but I think you brought the point up that was really good about it. And I think what's happening is reality is most countries with teeth, right, are on the path of less civil liberties, and we'll sort of have a freak out. How, like, the rate in which Bitcoin wins, like how fast it wins, it to me is like how the reaction is going to be. If it's very slow, there'll be no reaction, and it'll be semi-ignored because politicians are busy with other shit. So it's kind of good in a way. If it's extremely fast, well, they also get caught with their pants down. What worries me is sort of like the middle ground, where it's fast enough and loud enough that politicians care and have to sort of like go after the evil Bitcoiners who caused hyperinflation, which is not ideal. And I think having sort of like citizenship from small little countries and things like that is not going to help most people. The level of wealth that people need to have those solutions really work for them is a lot higher than people think. And strangely enough, one of the countries with the most amount of financial surveillance, which is the US, seems to be the place that will likely be the safest for Bitcoiners in red states. Or finding a refuge outside of Europe in countries where there's a certain level of history of respecting private property, and have some sense of rule of law. I think the idea of just hopping around is going to be substantially curtailed, and it's just going to be weird. I don't think we have a precedent, and I no longer think that the sovereign individual thesis sort of like fits the new world we live in.
Yeah, I can definitely see your I think the last few months, or the last year or so, definitely leads in that direction. I mean, the way in which these kind of new restrictions, just the way that they jump from one to the next one, and enormous curtailment of people's freedoms, and the way it just happens as an afterthought, like nobody even discusses it, nobody even there's no debate about it. Somebody just makes a decision, and then you find the public health guy just gets on TV and says, hey, from now on you can't do this and you have to do that. And the way that it's done the way that it's greatly coordinated all over the world by all these governments at the same time is just incredible. It's amazing. I don't know, but then again, you look around and you see, it's not totally bleak. Like, some governments have bucked the trend. So you look at places like Sweden, Belarus, maybe Croatia, Nicaragua, Costa Rica. You see some signs of it's not entirely all uniform all over the world, and maybe in the next few years we're going to see some of these places benefit enormously from getting more money and more immigrants and more investors. Who knows? But yeah, I agree with you that I think that it almost feels naive the way that people in 2018 and 2019 were talking about the sovereign individual, including me. Calcob? Can you speak? Can you speak?
Yeah, can you hear me?
Yep.
Yeah, Saif, just wondering how you see it playing out there. Rolfo was saying that once Bitcoin wins, like, can you see a time when paper Bitcoins become a problem? Where banks then sort of build up massive supplies. What sort of defenses do you see against that, like forks and things like that?
I think the main defenses, and this is the topic of the last few chapters in the book on scaling Bitcoin, on Bitcoin banking. I think that the real defenses that Bitcoin has, as opposed to gold, on this is, number one, the supply is auditable, so everybody in the world can see. Everybody in the world can see the supply and see how who's got how much from the supply. And so that's just makes it far easier to detect any kind of shenanigans taking place anywhere. I think that's enormously helpful. And then the other thing is that it's the saleability across space, which is kind of the main analytical framework of the book. The fact that you can just move Bitcoin out very quickly and send it halfway across the world, that's the most important defense. In other words, like I look in the first few chapters, I talk about the birth of fiat. When fiat was born, you had a lot of you had the central banks of the world basically tell their citizens to take a hike. We give us your gold, and here's a bunch of papers, and what are you going to do about it? We're at war with the evil Germans, or we're at war with the evil whatever, and if you don't give us your gold, then you are on the side of the evil people. Now, you couldn't just say, no, screw you, I want to keep my gold, and I'm going to continue to operate my own full gold node and be able to trade with the rest of the world. You couldn't do that with gold, but you can do that with Bitcoin. You can tell them, screw you and your stupid war. I'm taking my Bitcoin out. I mean, well, I'm not turning my Bitcoin in, because you can still spend the Bitcoin. That's the key difference. Like yes, they still have the guns, but they need to go and take the Bitcoin from you, which makes it much more complicated. With fiat, there was never a forcible confiscation. And the Bank of England didn't send police to every house to take people's gold. Everybody had to use the banks. The banks were under control of the Bank of England, so the Bank of England just had to take the gold from the banks that everybody had to rely on. But with Bitcoin, we're going to have far more banks, and therefore it's going to be far more decentralized. Or it's not going to be really, maybe not even far more banks. It's going to be far more nodes than banks. So it's going to be a far more decentralized ecosystem. That, in my mind, is the main and most important defense.
Yeah, no, great answer. The way I sort of seen it myself was, as we go further down the road here, people start, so the big established banks now, a lot of them might start buying up people who are stacking Bitcoin, say like the Coinbases, Grayscales, all them sort of boys, like the JP Morgans and all, start coming in and buying them, and basically start to, like, I don't think them banks or institutions are ever going to declare their Bitcoin holdings, or how could we ever force them to? So nobody would really know what them big institutions, the amounts that they hold. The sort of defense to me that's number one is the idea that the network could fork in some way and force them to, obviously, if they have stacks of paper Bitcoin, they would have no defense against that, because they'd be left unable to provide their customers with the Bitcoin. But how that would ever be, we know basically that a fork's basically impossible to organize on a massive scale, so that might never play out like that. It's interesting. I don't really know where it goes, but no, look, thanks for the answer anyway.
Nation state attacks, and obviously central banks are looking at CBDCs. I'm just kind of curious to get your thoughts. I mean, you've given obviously Bitcoin a lot of thought. If you had to sit in the chair of a central banker and you had a competing offering in the form of a central bank digital currency, and you said, look, why would anybody use this if BTC is an option? How would you attack Bitcoin in order for people to be convinced to not use that and instead use your, like you said, panopticon digital offering? Any thoughts around that? And do you give any credence to the idea of maybe false flags that might sort of improperly indicate Bitcoin as terrorist money or something to that effect? Thank you.
Thank you. I think, and I say this in the Bitcoin Standard, and I also say it in the Fiat Standard, I think the most effective way to attack Bitcoin would be to make a better monetary system. I think it would be the opposite of central bank digital currencies. So if you went on something like the gold standard, that would provide people with a lot of economic freedom, and that would undermine the case for Bitcoin. Although that, the cat is out of the bag now. Like, this was a far more convincing argument when I made it in 2018, when Bitcoin's market cap was what was it back then? Maybe 100 billion or something like that. When it was like 100 billion. And gold was at around 10 trillion. So gold was about 100 times bigger than Bitcoin. You could have maybe, doubled down on gold's basically head start and much larger liquidity. And if you had government support for it, then maybe you could have gotten rid of the threat of Bitcoin. Unlikely, but I think far more likely than the case now, when Bitcoin's already at $1 trillion, and so it's already at around a tenth of gold. In fact, the last chapter in the Fiat Standard specifically talks about central bank digital currencies. I think the really important thing about central bank digital currencies, in light of the analysis of my book, is that they potentially can change the game for the analysis of the entire book, in that the whole book talks about how the fiat standard is built on debt. And one aspect that has maintained, in my opinion, fiat's longevity is the fact that debt money is kind of self-correcting in a way. The more credit expansion you make, the more business cycles you create, the more recessions you'll inevitably cause. And when these recessions happen, you get a collapse in the money supply. And that, in the long run, makes up a huge difference. So let's say you get 10% growth in money supply for 10 years or 5 years, let's say. And then in the 6th year, you get the business cycle, and you have a big, giant economic crash, and the money supply crashes by 10, 20, 30%. That's, at the end of the 6th year, you're going to have a much smaller total growth rate in the money supply than if you had with the money supply just continuing to grow. And I think that's kind of the threat with central bank digital currencies. Central bank digital currencies are essentially just printing money. It's not credit money. It's like paper money, but it's digital. It's like the government printing money and handing it out to people. So it's similar to what they're doing in Lebanon and Venezuela now. They're just handing out cash and wondering why it is that everything is becoming more expensive. And all the traders, all the merchants are just choosing to hike prices at the same time. Well, you're just handing out money, and that money doesn't go away. There's no way of destroying that money easily like you do with credit money, which is digital money that's destroyed when the business cycle falls apart. So I think CBDCs are not a competitor to Bitcoin. I think they're much more likely to be seen as an advertisement to Bitcoin in reality. I think what they're going to do is they're just going to make Bitcoin far more popular, because they're going to expose that they're just going to allow central banks to do their job much more efficiently. They're going to be far more inflationary, and they're going to be far more surveillance. They're going to allow the central banks more surveillance, more inflation, and that's just going to advertise Bitcoin's value proposition. I don't really know. I think maybe it's just me and the way that I think, but I can't think of anything other than just make better policy and make better money if I wanted to tell them how to. So I don't expect them to ask me anyway.
One of the other things that has also come up is this idea of that CBDCs allow for the general public to interact directly with the central bank, sort of going around the need for banking as usual. And I think that there's an interesting relationship now between the retail banks and commercial banks, and then the central bank, in that, the public at large has to deal with these banks, but these CBDCs now mean that there's an entire banking sector who's not weak by any stretch, who's literally going to get written out of the picture. And so I'm sort of wondering whether or not there might even be allies. Do you see the bank? Interestingly enough, right, the enemy of my enemy. Do you see the banks themselves and their billions potentially being interested in BTC as an alternative and sort of being seen as, we're still relevant, or we can offer you an alternative to this, because they're literally being written out of the picture if you implement a CBDC standard?
Absolutely, I think so. I've seen people talk about this, and I think it's an entirely distinct possibility that central banks are trying to go around banks and take us to something similar to the Soviet monetary system, where you just had one central bank and everybody had an account with it. And I think banks' survival might have to come by pivoting to Bitcoin. So that's another example of why I think central bank digital currencies help Bitcoin, because now you've got the entire banking sector thinking of how can we maintain our business in a world in which money just goes back to becoming a mechanism for government to redistribute and control and decide what people should be able to spend their money on. Yeah.
Okay, cool. So first off, congratulations on the Fiat Standard. I can't wait to get my copy. The other thing, I've been getting questions from my Arabic-speaking followers about the sustainability of the blockchain technology down the line when it comes to Bitcoin, because increasingly more and more people are opting to allocate some of their savings to coin. So I wasn't exactly sure. I mean, what's your take? Can you add a little bit more color on the future of the blockchain? I mean, is it set in stone, or is it something that could be altered down the line?
I think generally using the word blockchain is a very counterproductive idea. Generally, when people talk about the blockchain, then almost certainly they don't know what they're talking about. Blockchain is just the ability to run a payment network without a central party. Basically, the solution to the Byzantine general problems, the problem of the Byzantine generals, the idea that you can arrive at consensus without there having to be somebody who decides what is right and what is wrong. This is really what is called the Nakamoto consensus. That's only working in Bitcoin. Provably, only Bitcoin has Nakamoto consensus. Provably, only Bitcoin has the ability to solve the Byzantine generals problem. We've seen with other digital currencies, they don't have that. We know when shit hits the fan, then everybody looks for one guy for each blockchain, and he says, all right, suspend trading, you do this, you do that, and let's get this fixed. So they don't really solve the Byzantine generals' problems. So there's no point really in talking about blockchain. And I don't understand what people talk about when they say blockchain, because it's just become this buzzword that means different things for different people, but everybody likes to talk about it because they want to be talking about all the important and nice sounding buzzwords. But really, what we have is with Bitcoin, I think in my mind, is just that it's a technology for solving that Byzantine generals problem. And it allows us, because of that, it allows us to have a monetary policy that nobody can control. So I think that's extremely sustainable, because you can fit all of the world's value into that network, because you don't need to make more tokens. You just need people to put more of their subjective labor's value in that token, and then it appreciates more and more, and it gains more value. So I think it's extremely sustainable. And I think if you mean sustainability in terms of energy consumption, then yeah, I think it can consume more and more energy. And I think that's a good thing. Consumption of energy is what allows us to not have to spend all of our days washing our clothes. It's what allows us to travel far faster, safer, more efficiently. And Bitcoin is just a very energy intensive way of doing money, because it's far safer and more economical than having highly inflationary money that promotes conflict.
You know, it really hit me because when you recommended that we store our coins on a cold wallet, which I did, then I gave it to my mom, who is 70 and who is an absolute real paper money kind of generation and person. So I had to explain the concept behind Bitcoin and so on. And she did ask all the right questions. And that's these were the typical questions that everyone who is new to Bitcoin, and they don't understand the underlying technology in complete details, because if we wait for that to happen, no one would, only very few people would get their hands on or would like to have own coin. I mean,
Yeah, I mean,
so
the vast majority of people don't know how a fridge or a car works, and yet it does.
correct.
All right. Arb, you had a question?
I did. And also, I really kind of struck by the question that you addressed when you were talking about the future of the nation state with some previous questioners. Let me, gather my thought for a moment. I'm a follower of Aristotle, which is why your book really resonated with me when I found it. I'm very grateful for it. And because it gets to those fundamentals, as I've mentioned to you before, I will be teaching it when I teach economics. What is evil is founded on a lie, and in it is sown the seeds of its own destruction. So, I mean, a lot of the acceleration of this surveillance capitalism, which is quickly turning into surveillance, not capitalism, it's poorly built, and it's very hastily built, and it's built on top of an infrastructure that we're using right now to communicate what we're seeing to one another. And this is not an isolated incident. It's happening all over the world. Everyone is talking to each other about what they're seeing. You know, Australian friends are talking to American friends. We're talking to Austrian friends, about these overreaches that are very, very coordinated, but they're benefiting fewer and fewer and fewer people. And because they're benefiting fewer and fewer people, they're self-destructive. There's a book that I read that says, in order to be the greatest among you will be the servant of you all. And on this, vast fortunes have been built and huge business empires have been built by serving more and more people. Look at the Walmart model. We have our issues with it, but it serves so many people, and this is how it built this massive empire. Well, what the nation states are doing is exactly the opposite, and they're forgetting, in a really naive way, the value of everyone else on the planet. And they've been really blithe about it. I mean, even the people from the World Economic Forum, what's that guy who looks like Dr. Evil? He jokes that we only need so many robot polishers. He doesn't understand the economy at all. Where does, what Bitcoin, the empowerment that Bitcoin represents to us is, it's nothing short of revolutionary. My question for you has almost been answered. So you started answering it. You said maybe they could compete with it by building a better thing, genuinely a better thing that competes, that gets out there and competes. Do you see, from where you are now, in the same way that you said, well, maybe I didn't quite understand the sovereign individual. Maybe I was a little bit, back in 2018, 19, maybe I was a little bit optimistic about the sovereign individual. Is there any ways that we're being optimistic about the technology itself? I'm a technologist in the economic sense, but that's, as far as the coding and the programming, is there anything that we need to really watch out for beyond getting our coin on cold storage?
To be perfectly honest, I'm not by any means a technical expert on issues of Bitcoin, and so I don't really like to get out of my lane and pass technical the Fiat Standard. I discuss what in my mind is the kind of overarching security model of Bitcoin, which is, without having to be a software engineer, I think the economic incentives, I try and explain the two economic incentives that protect against the problems of there being a bug in the Bitcoin code or there being an attack against the Bitcoin code. So, we could discuss individual attacks and how they work, but I think the deeper issue is that there's this very strong economic incentive currently worth $1.2 trillion for a lot of people from all over the world to want to do their best to keep this network operating. That, I think, is the security model. But I don't really know much beyond that. Let's see, Jonathan, you want to go ahead?
Done this before. So I was asking a question. You may not know this, or maybe someone in this group could, but somebody sent me an article from Joe Kelly on how to kill Bitcoin. And I'm always a skeptic. I'm like, yeah, you can't kill it. But his argument was basically the government could play the game of Bitcoin and mine blocks the way you're supposed to be mining it. But over time, because they can spend way more money than a typical miner through print and go burr, that they could essentially just mine empty blocks forever until there's no incentive for miners to mine, or in general, they could just be mining it to where there's no reason to use it because all the transactions are always going to be zero. I didn't know if you ever read that article or anyone in here knows of that, if you can send me a response, because I haven't seen an article addressing that.
I think I'd say it's the same. It's the same issue, which is that it misses the enormous economic incentive for people who want to keep the network going, to pay honest miners to mine blocks that work. And I think the missing point here is that when governments are just continuing to run their printer in order to buy Bitcoin miners, they're just devaluing their currency next to Bitcoin. That's the kind of dynamic that takes place here. So on the one hand, you have Bitcoiners who want their transactions to go through because they need to make transactions with Bitcoin, and then they start paying higher transaction fees for Bitcoin miners who will settle those transactions. So this just makes mining Bitcoin more and more rewarding, increases the reward for potential Bitcoin miners, while also weakening the national currencies of the countries that are engaged in this attack, because they're increasing the supply massively. Again, this is one of those things where, yeah, theoretically you could play it out and you could make the argument about why it would happen, but that would be kind of a static analysis of this happens and then that happens. But in reality, the force of economic incentives in the long term would lead toward those two incentives, I would expect, overtaking the attack by the government. In other words, the more you print, the more you're weakening your currency. And the more you print with the intention of mining Bitcoin, the more you're exposing to the world and telling the world that, hey, we're going to debase your currency in order to fight Bitcoin. Who wants to be holding that currency when it's being massively debased? So the government that launches this is going to have a foreign exchange problem because people are going to be dumping its currency. So if your government is launching that attack, why would you want to hold their currency? You could just dump your currency and go and hold another currency. And on the other hand, Bitcoiners will just pay higher transaction fees for the miners who mine, for the miners who will be mining honestly. So you're increasing the incentive for miners, you're decreasing the power of the currency and devaluing the currency. I mean, in theory, perhaps it'll work. Let's see them try. But I think, and I should add another kind of factor that goes into this is the fact that Bitcoin mining is open. Anybody can join Bitcoin mining. Anybody can build an ASIC. Anybody can get on the network. Nobody can stop anybody from getting on the network. And mining can go, mining can go underground. It can go, it can become bootleg. People will start mining in isolated locations in the middle of nowhere. And the more they do this, the more the incentive for mining. So it sounds to me like it's one of those arguments that's similar to saying, well, then government is just going to buy up all the drugs on the market and make drugs illegal, and then drugs will die. Well, we haven't seen that happen, drug prohibition hasn't worked pretty much anywhere. So I guess the kind of really silly thing about these arguments is that we're witnessing fiat currencies collapse in front of our eyes all over the world, let me repeat this. Let me say this from the perspective of somebody who was living in Lebanon. And I used to hear these arguments from my colleagues and from economists and from lay people for many years about, well, Bitcoin is, one day the NSA is going to do this and the guy is going to do that, and then they're going to blah, blah, blah. And governments are going to ban it, and governments are not going to allow it. And it doesn't have a central bank that can protect its value. And you know what happened? Well, since, take the average colleague of mine who gave me these arguments, since then, Bitcoin's up maybe 20, 30 fold, and the Lebanese lira. So at some point, you have to ask yourself, what's a more significant threat? Is it these elaborate thought experiments that involve the world's central banks printing infinite quantities? It's at some point, it's like you're on the sinking Titanic and you're telling me, no, this lifeboat is stupid because, well, what if, aliens come and abduct us? Maybe, but at this point, you're on a sinking boat anyway. So at some point, you have to weigh these kind of scenarios against the alternative. That's the main argument, is that it's very easy for somebody to write a blog post and then make some assumptions and then conclude that, see, I've proven to myself and to the people who take me seriously that this is going to happen. But the question is, all right, so what is your alternative? What do you recommend that people in Lebanon do? And this is, I say this as somebody who lived in Lebanon. What does this guy who wrote this blog post suggest that someone like me in Lebanon do? Do you have a better alternative? I don't think so.
Thank you for your response, and thank you for orange pilling my hero, Jordan Peterson, yesterday.
You're welcome. My pleasure. All right, data veteran, an old-time mutual follow of mine on Twitter. How are you doing? Good to see you here. You're muted. Data veteran, can you hear me?
Oh, did I?
Okay, now we can hear you.
Right. Okay. I just was listening in on this conversation about the government.
There's a lot of background noise behind you. If you could try and make it better by any way,
okay.
Appreciate it.
Let me give me a second.
Mark?
Yeah, one final question, Saif, while you're there, or to anyone in the group. So fast forward, I would say in a Bitcoin world, what does central banking look like in that world? That's the question. That's to anyone here, not just you, Saif.
In my mind, central banking ends up looking like plumbing, something extremely critical, but extremely boring and extremely reliable. Bitcoin just turns, managing a Bitcoin node. Managing a Bitcoin node is going to be the equivalent of central banking. The Bitcoin node is a functional replacement of a central bank. So the first thing that happens is, instead of having 200 central banks, we have maybe 20,000, maybe 200,000, who knows, maybe even 2 million central banks in the world. And so a central bank becomes something like, the community of each central bank is like, a family or an extended family or a small little village or a small neighborhood. That's what a central bank will be like, that's the final unit of settlement. And each one of those central banks is going to be able to perform final settlement of money. So in my mind, we end up with it being a small scale utility. Ideally, So ideally at a size where it's something like 150 people per central bank at most, so that we're under the Dunbar number, so that every central bank member, everybody in a central bank knows everybody else. And so we've got millions of these central banks all over the world. And each one of them is able to perform final settlements with each other central bank. And they charge a small, very tiny fee to cover their costs and to make a little bit of a profit. And if they do their job exceptionally well, they make a lot of profit. And then they expand and they build more central banks and provide more service to more people. And then if they don't do their job well, they, people leave them and go to other central banking providers and just use them. And that's really the way that I see it. It's just a very boring, regular business, which doesn't allow anybody to be a parasite on society.
Cheers, Seb. Just want to get that question in because I got to go and put kids to bed myself as well. So thanks a lot. Thanks for orange pilling Jordan Peterson yesterday. That was great.
Cheers. Thank you, Mark.
Thanks.
All right. Data Veteran is back. Data Veteran. Yeah, we can hear you now.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. I'm sorry if there's a background noise. Is it still a background noise over here right at this moment? Is it okay?
It's okay, yeah. Sounds good.
Okay. Yeah, I'm at the bar, so forgive me for this interruption. I was overhearing the conversation about, governments attacking the Bitcoin network. Unlikely because it's a kind of a stratification, because once you get into that space where Bitcoin becomes geopolitical, which it is becoming geopolitical, we have governments that are protecting the Bitcoin network. So for instance, we have the El Salvador that's doing Bitcoin mining with geothermic energy and the volcanoes. And that's where we're going to head. We're going to go down that path where more governments are going to join the Bitcoin network and do the honesty mining. And remember that mining is not the security of the Bitcoin network. It's one piece of the security of the Bitcoin network, but it's not the security piece. As of now, we are seeing more and more governments and counties all over the world getting more interested in the Bitcoin network. And if they can profit from participating in this network, I think they will do that. So I think gradually this idea that there's one big government can step in and take over the network is going to gradually diminish as the network grows bigger, because it's all about the network effect.